Thank you, Tanner, and thank you to Lyle and Jen and everybody coming together to make things happen. If you haven't figured it out already, there are two of us that usually are in the room that are not in the room. So CP is a close contact and was not allowed to be around. And then towards the end of this week, I tested positive for the Rona. So I am coming to you live from the basement, although you're not going to get it live. It's live for me now, but not live for you. It's pre-recorded, but same deal. So that does not change things. We are going to do our best to kind of roll with the punches and move things along, but I will be out of my quarantine in a couple of weeks, but we'll still bring you content and sermons and everything. This next week is Thanksgiving, and some of you are kind of wondering what's going to happen during that. Well, we have Thanksgiving Eve service, and at this point we're planning to have the Thanksgiving Eve service. The part that'll be different about it is some of you may not feel comfortable attending, and like every year we're still going to broadcast it live over YouTube. But one of the other things that we're going to do is the part you miss by being home and not coming is you don't get to have that fresh bread smell. You don't get to participate in communion within the room. But what we do understand is that you can still participate where you are at. And so actually, towards the beginning of next week, Pastor Craig made a video that we're kind of editing together of him baking bread that you can follow along and bake the exact same kind of bread, and you can actually have your own communion service so that the elements would be there and you can participate with us on Wednesday evening. So stay tuned to Facebook and all of that for the video coming. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other announcements that Tanner and Lisa and everybody will get out to you. So today, if you're joining us live, awesome. Thank you for filling the pews. And if you are on YouTube, thank you. Make sure you comment in the stream, letting everybody know that you're here, and say hi. I think this week we're giving away some Breadsmith cards. So maybe you don't want to bake the bread and you want to get some Breadsmith bread. That would work too. But we are finishing our series of Habakkuk. So we are finishing up. We've gotten to chapter 3, the big culmination. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pray. I'm going to tell you a little story, like usual, and then we're going to jump in and kind of go through chapter 3. So I invite you to pray with me. Spirit, I ask that this morning, that right now, that you would be able to speak. That you would take the words, the thoughts that I have, the things that I've prepared, and that you would be able to speak through those and past those. That you would help the busyness of the day to be quieted. That you would help the anxiety of the moment to be quieted. To all of the things that culminate this morning, that you would help them to be put to the back. And that you would come to the forefront and that you would speak to us here this morning. Just like in the beginning when you took dirt of the ground, Adamah, and you spoke life, and Adam was, I pray that you would speak that same life today. In your name, Jesus, amen. Okay, so the first thing that I want to tell you is a little bit of a story, and it goes about 18 years ago, actually almost 18 years ago now. Carrie and I were standing and doing one of these, saying the I do's and the I wills, and we're getting married, and it's the part for the vows. And so we're standing there and we have our hands in each other, and so I'm holding her hands and she has her hands into mine, you know, and you're looking at each other and you have this moment, and I'm repeating what Seth is saying to me and I'm saying to her, and she keeps going like this and sticks her hand back in there. Like, this is before the corona, and so you're not quite as leery about sniffles. And eventually then one of our friends is playing a song and we're kind of looking at each other, and so she keeps wiping her nose and putting her hand in there. And in one of those moments that you go, like, we both looked at each other and did the, you're sticking it back in my hands Okay, yeah, we could go with this. And I'll keep that in your brain, but not too much to the front, and I'll come back to that later. Now I want to jump into Habakkuk. So we're looking at Habakkuk chapter 3. Chapter 3, if you haven't been following along, here's the backdrop. So you have chapter 1 where Habakkuk is laying out his claim to God. He's like, God, why? Why are you letting horrible things happen to us? Why are you letting the unrighteous people rule over the land? And God says, don't worry, I'll respond, and I'll give you what you want, actually. I'm going to have the Babylonians come, and they're going to execute some judgment on the people of Israel because they don't listen. You're right, Habakkuk. They don't listen, and they're not going to be able to govern themselves, so I'll do it for them. And Habakkuk turns around in chapter 2 and he says, no, or at the end of chapter 1, no, God, that's not what I wanted. I want you to do something, but I don't want you to do that thing. That thing is the thing that I don't want you to do. And God says, no, wait. Just wait, because I will take care of things. Eventually, he will bring the Persians in, and they will conquer the Babylonians. And in the end, Habakkuk, the Babylonians will get what they're due. Don't you worry about that. But what you need to do is be faithful in the midst of that. That while my deliverance is slow, or it seems far off, it comes exactly when it's supposed to. And the word there was the way that it's brought to you is with a panting voice, like somebody runs as fast as they can to tell you deliverance is on the way. Then we get to the end of chapter 2, and God lays out this long thing of the woes against, basically woes are curses in the Hebrew, curses against the Babylonians, which also gives us the opposite side of those as righteous people should live not this way, the opposite of the woes. And then we get to the very end, and God goes, tells Habakkuk, and the Lord is in his temple, and the Hebrew says, hush, as in, we're done talking. Habakkuk, you can be quiet now. I've spoken. It's done. And then we have this span of time that we don't know how long, but a span of time where eventually Habakkuk comes back with a response, but not one where he argues with God. And here we'll jump in now. So this is chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. A prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, on Shigionoth. Now, yeah, I did say that. Getting shiggy with it was one of the jokes that I heard this week, but I don't think that's a funny joke. Shigionoth, we have no idea what that means. But what we do know is that it is a term of a worship or ceremonial sense that's used within the Psalms. And so what we find is it's way warmer in my basement than I thought it was going to be. What we find is the only other place this is used is in Psalm 8. And in Psalm 8, here we find David crying out to the Lord because bad people are coming and trying to do things to him. And it's a psalm of kind of struggle and lament, but also God kind of winning through. And so what we know is rather than just a prayer, this is more of a corporate psalm. And at the very end, we find that Habakkuk was probably a minister of music, so to speak. He was in the group within the priests that played a stringed instrument. And so at the very end, he says, and play this on my stringed instrument. As in, I want you to actually use it when the people gather. So that's the first thing that we kind of have to wrap our arms around. As we jump in then, verse 2 is really where things start to kind of kick it off. And it starts out, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Now we have this kind of juxtaposition of Habakkuk having his colloquy, his struggle with God, his argument back and forth, where he interrogates God and God comes back with an answer. And then we find him here saying, Lord, we know of the great things that you've done. Do them again. Remind us. repeat those things in our day. Those amazing things that you have done, bring them into our lives now. We've heard the stories. We know all of the stories from our childhood. We know all of these things, but deep down inside, bring those stories to life in us today, not just back then, but now. Now, this is far more important than you think. So this sets up the whole rest of the psalm. You have to grasp this concept that he begins by saying, God, you have done great things, and I remember them. I remember them, and I look back to them, and that proves that you can do great things now. Do them. Now, as we move into verse 3 and following, here we begin to see Habakkuk actually interacting with those great things from the past, actually looking back to see how he can look forward. Verse 3, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Now, if you don't know the geography of Israel and the surrounding area, this isn't real helpful for you. So here's what I'm going to do. Here's a map right here. And within this map, this is the one we've been looking at for a while, you can see the Middle East area. Now, I'm going to zoom in, and you can see just the area that is down by Egypt and Sinai and up into the southern part of Israel, what's known as Judah. Now, the important part here is when he says, you came from Teman, you are the Holy One from Mount Paran, he is beginning the story of the Exodus. You see the arrows pointing up, and either Sinai is on one side in the Sinai Peninsula, or else it's on the opposite side. So there's two different schools of thought. The point is from Mount Sinai, where you gave us the law, where we became your covenant people, you came north to us as they follow the Exodus journey from the south up into the north, around and into the promised land. So he's recalling the power of the Exodus story. So as God comes from Teman, comes from Mount Paran, comes from the south, and brings salvation with him, the people are brought from Egypt into the wilderness, travel around, go to Sinai, receive the law, and now they're moving north. They begin to travel as a group of people that God is leading them every step of the way. Sometimes they do good things, and sometimes they do bad things. They had to live in the wilderness for quite a while near Mount Paran, and eventually God brings them to the promised land, the place where they're at now. Continuing verse 3. His glory, as in God's glory, covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor, literally his radiance, was like the sunrise, like the dawn. Rays flashed from his hands where his power was hidden. Plague went out before him. Pestilence followed his steps. And now, when you read this, you have to remember that this section from Habakkuk, think of him as a person writing a song that's also a bit of poetry. And now when you get into that, you can say things that are different than what they mean. You can use metaphor and allegory in order to interpret and shape things of what you're trying to say. So here in this section, what I want you to imagine as we read through this is the Exodus story, God bringing his people out of bondage in Egypt, into the desert, to Sinai, up into the wilderness that's just outside of Israel to the south, and eventually into the promised land. So you have that story. And then you have this sort of almost kind of an overlay where Habakkuk overlays this idea of a storm. And we talked about this in previous chapters, that there's the storms that come from the Mediterranean, and there are the really bad storms that come from the south and the east, out in the desert where there's no water. And so these storms are the big ones. And what you can imagine is the story of God's people coming from the Exodus, him leading them, but also overlaid on top of that is this sort of metaphor of God as a storm. as the one that comes to bring these things, and he's really scary. So when you read back through that, you see the heavens are covered in his glory, praises fill the earth, radiance like sunshine flashes, think lightning flashing from his hands, places where his power is hidden. So you hear the thunder and you go, what is that? And then the lightning. And then you find the interweaving here, where in verse 5, where he says, plagues went before him, and pestilence followed his steps. And so here you know from the Exodus story that a part of the 10 plagues and the pestilence, the things that God tried to do to get Pharaoh to release his people. Moving on, verse 6. He stood and he shook the earth. He looked and he made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled. The age-old hills collapsed. But he marches on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, and the dwellings in Midian in anguish. Here we see Habakkuk using this imagery of God standing there as a powerful one, like one of the rulers, but also like this storm moving, going throughout the nations, moving up past the mountains, beginning to shake the tents of Cushan and Midian. These are the areas down in the south. The wind begins to blow, things begin to stir. Verse 8, were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow. And you called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Here you see the storm moving from the south up to the north. And they don't usually come that way. So when they do, they are powerful. And we see the wind blowing and the waters falling. We see the rivers rising. That even to the place where he says, you split the earth with rivers. Now this is areas, if you imagine like a mountainside, and the rain comes down and you see these streams begin to collect and flow down, that areas that didn't get any rain at all are beginning to flood with water. Verse 10. Torrents of water swept by the deep, and it roared and lifted its waves high. Here we see God churning his heavenly storm, his power, his glory moving northward. The sun and the moon stood still in the heavens. Now let's just pause there. I don't think it means that they physically stood still, but that when the cloud of the Lord covers everything, darkness falls where the Lord's presence is. You can't even see the sun, the stars, nor the moon. And so they don't practically exist when you look up. They stood still because the Lord covered everything. This huge storm is moving. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens. At the glint of your flying arrows, remember the lightning flying out, at the lightning and the flashing of your spear, in wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. Verse 13, you came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. I'll just pause there for a second. What we see here is the actuality of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. That in order for the king, David, and eventually David to begin the line that brings Jesus, that changes all things, that anointed one, that anointed family has to come out of bondage, has to come out of Egypt and make its way into Israel. You came to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. Here you should hear the story of Pharaoh. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear you pierced his head. With warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though to devour the wretched who were hiding. Now you remember the chariots are chasing down the Israelites in the Exodus. This is Habakkuk bringing back that memory of the greatest story that they've known in their history. You, Lord, trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. So just like the Red Sea parts and the people of Israel go through, Habakkuk is saying, like a chariot with horses drawing the water up and splashing it out, you went through the water and made a way for us. Now this part concludes his memory, his looking back. So what we have is he begins this section here of saying, God, I look to you. And I look to those areas in your story that are my story. I look to those areas that you have done amazing things, amazing deeds, and know that I can look forward. And then he tells the story of God as a storm moving throughout, bringing the people from Egypt out of the Exodus into salvation, into the promised land, into a covenant relationship. When we get to verse 16, this is where we begin to turn inward, where Habakkuk takes all of those things that he looks backwards when he's looking back in faith, and now he begins to take a look here. He begins to take a look at the person writing the actual psalm. Verse 16, I heard and my heart pounded. Literally the Hebrew says, and my belly trembled. That the idea of your heart was really your loins most of the time. I heard and something churned within my stomach. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones. Literally my bones were rotting, as in I was so weak that I couldn't stand. My legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently. Now this is the NIV version. The Hebrew here is a little more like, because I must wait, rather than yet I will wait. So we have this, my heart is pounding, my lips are quivering, my body is so tired it can't even stand, because I must wait. I must wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. I must wait for Babylon, for the Babylonians to get theirs. For you to fulfill that thing that you told me just now, that you would take care of them, that we would come back. Now I have to wait. And it hurts and it feels weird and the anxious moments come, and here I'm left with this being the only prophet that says God's going to do something, just wait. Verse 17, he digs in. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there is no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exalt the Lord. Yet I will be joyful in God my Savior. Despite there being, now, and these are kind of the basics within prosperity within that area. There's no figs, there's no grapes, there's no olives, there's nothing from the field, so no wheat, and there's no animals in the stalls. When there is nothing, this literally happens. The Babylonians come and they take people off into exile and they destroy everything. The temple is completely destroyed in 587. Everything is taken with them, all of the goods, all of the figs, all of the grapes. No fields are left, no animals are left. And here we have people going, it's gone. Habakkuk is saying, though there's nothing at all, even in that moment when there's nothing, I'll rejoice. Even in that moment, I will exalt you and I will find my joy in you because you are my deliverer. You are my Savior. Even in the most struggling moment of despair, even when the story finds its lowest of lows, Habakkuk says, I'll still have faith. I'll still rejoice and exalt in you. Verse 19, for the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. For the director of music on my stringed instruments. Now here, within verse 19, what we see here is he's saying, even though despair looms, even though everything looks bad, even in that moment, you're my strength. And you will make me like the deer that can climb to the highest heights. Now, most of us don't grasp this because we don't live in mountainous areas. And you've probably been to the Black Hills and you see the big goats and stuff kind of walking up on the sides. But the point here is when you live in an area that has mountains and valleys, high areas and low areas, when the storm is coming, where do you want to be? You want to be up high. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. I am sure-footed to go to the upper places, to the highest heights, so that down where it's scary, down where the waters are raging, down where the torrent is, I don't have to be there. I can be where you are. That even though despair looms, you will make my feet like those that can climb to the safe places. Now, when we look at this, it's kind of easy to kind of read the story and just kind of pass through it. But what I want to do is I actually saw a illustration of this from I saw it from Craig Groeschel, who was doing a Habakkuk series, and he got it from a secular writer called Seth Godin, but it's called The Dip. And you'll see it here. I'll put it up here. But what happens is we find this place in our lives where things start to go good, and we kind of come up the hill, and something good happens, and we have this area that we can look to, and then eventually there's a dip, and we go down. And so we see this high, and then the low comes, and we have the choice then to either make our way up, which is the hard path, or to go back. Go back to the place in the beginning where there was despair, where you just struggle. Or I suppose you could stay, and that could still be considered going back. And the point here that I've kind of think that Habakkuk is making is within this chapter, he's saying you're in the dip. And where you want to be is up high. You want to go up to the top. You want to go to that place that God's leading. And the struggle is still that you're in that dip of despair. You're in that place that hurts, like Habakkuk. And what you do is what Habakkuk did. You look back to the places that God has moved within your life. For Habakkuk, he looks back to the greatest story of God's deliverance. He looks back to the Exodus and says, I know that you can do it. I've heard the story since I was a boy of the amazing things that you've done, so I will look to that, and it will help me get through. It will lead me through this pit and this down part of despair to something more. So here you can see the dip. Now earlier I told you the story of when Carrie and I got married and we were holding hands and doing the vows, and she kept wiping her nose and sticking her hand back in my hand, and we're holding hands, and it's kind of this goofy thing. And here's the thing. I will never, ever, ever forget that. It was one of those moments that's just so bizarre that you laugh about, but it's one of those moments that reminds me of that day. Now, when I do weddings, when I officiate weddings with people, if you're one of the spouse or one of the couples that I've married in the past few years, I do this thing where I take a moment before we say the vows, and I have each person look at each other. So the bride looks at the groom looks at the bride, and I let them know that's your wife. That's your husband. That even though the world will shake, even though the good things may not be so good in a little while, even though the struggles may come for rich, for poor, for sickness, for health, for the good, the bad, the COVID, the craziness, the things going on, the anxiety, depression, maybe a good job, a bad job, that regardless of all those things, that person is the one that says, I love you more than anything else. More than anything else. And I let them know that they must remember that. Because when the dip in your life comes, you need something to look to. Now, for us, practically, you need to ask the question specifically for yourself, just like Habakkuk did. He has the struggle of God, why are you letting bad things happen to us? And God says, I'll give you the answer, but you're not going to like it. And he's right. And Habakkuk responds, you're right, I don't like that answer. I don't want that answer. I want my answer. And in the end, Habakkuk says, even though I didn't get the answer that I really wanted, can still look to the amazing things that you have done to know where you're going. That is because of your faithfulness, because of your promises kept, that I know that you will keep this one moving forward. So maybe this morning, wherever you're at, if you're in the pews or you're at home in YouTube land, maybe you're at that place where you're in the low. Maybe you're in the despair spot. Maybe you're down in the dip and you're looking up and you're trying to find the next place, the next thing, that the anxiety seems to be piling high, that those moments where you're not really sure, maybe you're in the dip. Remember those moments where God has moved in your life. We have the biblical story. Habakkuk just told us the greatest story within the Old Testament community. For them looking back, the Exodus was the story. Without the Exodus, there's nothing else. If there's no Exodus, then there's no Genesis story that comes afterwards, because nobody would have told it. With the Exodus, we have that. But each of you has your own Exodus. Each of you has your own Egypt that you lived through, and God came in and delivered you. Like the storm that comes from the south, and it might be scary at times. God brought you to a place where you discovered that you were His. That He longed for you to be in that relationship. Where is that in your life that you can look to be able to endure, to enable you to persist, to lead yourself out of this dip, out of this struggling area? Now maybe you're watching on YouTube, or maybe you're in the pews this morning, and you don't really have that. You've been around for a long time. Maybe you've watched a few sermons here or there and seen a few songs, and maybe you don't have that moment that you can look back to and feel confident in that. Here's the thing. If you don't have that moment, what you need to know is that there is one greater than the dip. There is one greater than your despair. There is one greater than your struggle. There is one greater than your anxiety. There is one greater than your ability to have enough money. There is one greater than all the bills piling up. There is one greater than all the Republicans, all the Democrats, all the communists, all the socialists, all the whatever, fill in the blank. There is one greater than all of those things, and He says, come. He is the one that makes the waters churn, that drives the water out like a chariot, but He's also the one that says, come to me when you are weary. Come to me when you are laid down and burdened. Come to me and I will give you rest. Now, as we finish Habakkuk, that is the story for you, for all of us. That when we're in that place of struggle, that we need to be able to cry out to God and say, I don't get it. And know in faith that God will respond. That God will bring us to a place that maybe we don't necessarily understand, or we like what He decides, or any of those things, but we know that He is moving. And that He desires us to be His people. Me, you, the people on YouTube, that all of us are this weird thing called the church. Now here's where things get kind of ironic. In verse 13, we find Habakkuk talking about, you came, Lord, to deliver your people through the Exodus, but also to deliver your anointed one. Now, as we sit at the place of just before Thanksgiving, but right at Advent, we now walk that moment of anticipation over the next few weeks that Habakkuk longed for. The one that is anointed, the one that would come and bring an end to this despair. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't ever have hard things in your life. That doesn't mean that you won't ever feel low ever again. But it does mean that you are not alone. That you have you have a person, a man, a physical man that went through all of the same struggles, that bore the burden of life, that had a mom to tell him the things that he didn't want to hear, that had a dad that helped him become the man that he is today, that we have a story that we can look to beyond just Old Testament stories, but a story of salvation, of one that came that says, you're mine, and you were bought at a price, and I would do anything for you. That is the story that we turn to in the coming weeks. Would you pray with me? Father, I ask that this morning that you would help us to see past the busyness of the day, past the stories and the metaphors and allegories and all of those things that maybe don't seem to understand, and help us to look to you. That when the darkness seems to loom, that your light would shine. That we would be able to look past the place of despair in our lives and see you. And that you would remind us of those amazing moments that help us move forward in this journey of faith. God, we know you have done great things. Would you continue to remind us so that we know that there are great things coming even yet? Jesus, in your powerful name. Amen. Would y'all stand and sing with us?